So I'm going to start with this picture, which I think captures what I like to think of as the global energy challenge. And the global energy challenge is, I think, what animates a lot of the work that we do here at the Harris School and at the university around energy. And so this is a picture in the middle of the day in Beijing, and I think it kind of perfectly captures what I think of as a global energy challenge, which is, think of it as a stool that has three legs. The first leg of the stool is, how do we get access to inexpensive energy and reliable energy that's so important for economic growth? And you can see in this picture the visceralness of being in Beijing and economic growth in China, and how much of that is powered by energy. You can see it was not very long ago, or surely it was not very long ago, that the guy in a cab was probably on a bike, and it's not going to be very long to the guy on a bike, it's going to be in a car. And all that was made possible by access to inexpensive and reliable sources of energy. The second leg of the stool is also quite visible, maybe even more visible. It's the middle of the day there in Beijing, and actually you can't see the sun. And the reason is the same sources of energy that are powering all that economic growth are also largely coming from fossil fuels and producing particulates pollution that are clouding out, covering up the sun. And along with that comes a series of health problems. They're not a mystery. Our guy on the bike seems very aware of them. He has a mask on. He has gloves on. And so the second leg of the stool is, if you want to have access to all this inexpensive and reliable sources of energy, how can you avoid the health problems that come with a lot of the energy choices that we make? The third leg of the stool is also, it's not quite as visible, but it's, you know it's there, which is the same energy that's powering this economic growth and producing all this air pollution is also involves the release of CO2. And that CO2 is increasing the odds of disruptive climate change. And so the challenge that I think is at the center of the global energy challenge is, how do you find ways to balance those three goals and to navigate between getting access to inexpensive and reliable sources of energy, while also preventing pollution that causes severe health problems and avoiding disruptive climate change. And those, achieving or balancing those three goals necessarily is going to involve trade-offs of economics and values and morals and things like that. And I think what we as economists can contribute to this is providing facts on what those trade-offs look like so that societies can make better choices. So to illustrate all that, I put together this talk that begins with 7 facts that I think define the global energy challenge. Many of these facts will not be new to you, but hopefully they'll come together in a new way. And I'll end then what I think are a couple of solutions. So the first is, energy is critical for growth. So there's few empirical, if you work with data, you find data is often very, very disappointing. You have views or ideas or hypotheses, and then the data somehow disappoints you and doesn't deliver on that. This is a rare example of that not being true. You can see that there's a very tight relationship between, on the horizontal axis, energy consumption per capita and GDP per capita. And what I want you to take away from it is, we just don't have any historical examples of countries achieving very high levels of living standards without using lots of energy. So I think you should think of that as almost like a necessity for societies to achieve the levels, the living standards that everyone around the world aspires to. The second fact is that energy access is a major problem around the globe. And there's a lot of ways to illustrate that. But one of my favorite is from looking at just per capita electricity consumption around the world. And so here I've just put up a couple of key countries. You can see in Canada, it's about 15,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. In the United States, it's about 13,000. And then you get to countries and places where there's lots and lots of people. And China, which is almost 1.4 billion people, they're about a third the level of energy consumption that we are. You can go further down to India. They're about a 13th of the energy consumption that we are. And then the state of Bihar, where actually I do a lot of research, there's 100 million people there, and they consume about 270 kilowatt hours per person per year. So that's like running a 60-watt bulb 12 hours a day. So it's really astonishing, the differences. And I think that's not a state of the world that if you live in one of those countries, you think this is really the way I want things to be. They don't have access to all the conveniences and the heating and the cooling and the lighting that we're used to. Okay, so the third fact should not be very surprising and almost follows from the second fact, that today's developing countries are the places where we're expected to see a lot of energy consumption growth. This figure is, for the first figure, just shows what's happened over the last 50 years. And in today's rich countries, here we've got, I think, Canada and the United States, there's been overall growth, but on a per capita basis, very, very little growth in the last 50 years. And you can see the Chinese economic miracle, they're actually at the bottom. And showing up in energy consumption. And if you stare hard enough, you can actually begin to see some increases in India. But now let's zoom ahead, and what are the projections for what's expected to happen? And what's very striking about what's projected to happen is that in the OECD, or the rich countries, there's expected to be almost no growth in demand in the coming decades, and very sharp and dramatic growth from today's developing countries. So that's another fact I want you to carry around. So let's just review where we're at. Energy is critical for growth. Energy access is a major problem, and today's developing countries is where we can expect to see lots of energy consumption growth going forward. So that's fine. What energy sources are we likely to see more consumption of as we go ahead? And the striking thing, despite what I think is often in the newspaper headlines, is that we expect to see most of it is expected to come from fossil fuels. So I think this is true. In the 1970s, fossil fuels accounted for about 81% of total energy supply. Today, they account for about 81% of total energy supply. And by 2040, they're projected to account for about 74%. So although renewables are growing very quickly, the standard models still have fossil fuels supplying most of the energy that the world is expected to consume as we go along. And I just want to emphasize, and we'll keep coming back to this in this talk, that a lot of that is because of the way we construct our energy markets. And I'm going to leave that, and we'll keep coming back to it. But let's just unpack a little bit in two primary sectors. Why is it that the fossil fuels are the primary source? And so here's a picture of what it costs to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity from different sources. The cheapest one is a coal plant that you could think of being built outside of the United States without lots of environmental controls. And it can produce a kilowatt hour of electricity at about 3 cents. A natural gas plant can produce one at maybe 4.5 or 5 cents. It's in the United States. It would be a little bit more in other countries because natural gas is so cheap here. And then you can start to get to the carbon-free and pollution-free technologies. And what's striking is that they're all about 2 to 3 cents, 2 to 3 times as expensive as using a coal or natural gas plant. And so once you see that, it's not terribly surprising that the standard models are predicting that people will continue to primarily rely on fossil fuels. And again, I just want to add the caveat, given the way that we construct energy markets, and that's something I'm going to keep coming back to. Okay, so that's in the power sector. What about in the transportation sector, where we read a lot about electric vehicles and the growth of Tesla? So this is a slightly complicated figure, and so let me try to talk it through. On the horizontal, so what I've done, so let's just start. I built two cars here. One car is an internal combustion engine car, like a standard car that runs on gasoline. And the second car is an electric vehicle. And the primary determinant of the lifetime costs of owning an internal combustion car is the price of gasoline, or the price of gasoline. And the primary cost of an electric vehicle right now is the price of the battery. And what you see, and so then what I've done here is try to estimate the, compare the lifetime costs of these two technologies. And in the pink area, the internal combustion engine cars are cheaper. And in the blue area, the electric vehicles are cheaper. And the red line that cuts through it are pairs of prices of a barrel of oil and the price of a battery per kilowatt hour, where there's equal costs over the lifetime. So now let's just look at a couple points here. So the price, if you went to the price of if you took as given the price of a battery that Tesla sells, now this is not for cars, this is for people's homes. I think that's about $480. So for those of you who can see the slide, what is the price of a barrel of oil that would lead to equal cost between an electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine? How much? $800. Now, how much does the price of a barrel of oil sell for currently? Like $60, maybe $70. So what that's trying to say, as the current cost of batteries, it's very, very hard for electric vehicles to compete. Now, a more optimistic view, and it's a little bit hard to figure out if this is exactly the right number, the cost of batteries it's closer to about $200, and there you get to a price of a barrel of oil. The price of a barrel of oil that would be necessary is lower, and although still quite a bit from the current global markets. And there, the last point is if you assume that there's innovation in batteries that brings down the cost even more. So, but the main point I want you to take away from this is, just like in the power sector, the economics of these markets are currently pushing people to relying on fossil fuels. And so that's what underlies a lot of the projections we saw. Okay, so it's not just, though, that fossil fuels are very cheap. It's that we've got a lot of them. And one way to illustrate this is to just look at the ratio of proven oil reserves to how much consumption we do in a given year. And what I just want you to take at the beginning of that, in 1980, we had about what we thought were about 35 years left of oil consumption left. And so now here we are in 2019, and you would have expected that if that was all the oil we're ever going to have, that we would be out of oil. And instead, actually, now we have about 50 years of consumption. And the point I want you to take away from this is that the guys who run the oil and gas companies are very, very smart and very, very effective at finding new sources. And so we're actually finding it faster than we're using it. And so one theory about fossil fuels and pollution has been that we're just going to run out of them. And what I take away from this is that at any time span that kind of matters from the climate perspective, we're never ever going to run out of fossil fuels. Maybe we will choose not to use them, but it's not because we're going to run out of finding inexpensive fossil fuels. The same is true for natural gas. And then for coal, we just seem to have endless amounts of coal. The amount is so large, I wouldn't take the particular number of years left as meaningful. Okay, so that's fine. Fossil fuels are inexpensive, and that's great, and we should celebrate that. But they tend to have two undesirable features that I want to talk about for a minute here. The first is fossil fuels increase pollution, air pollution, and we saw that air pollution in that picture, and that air pollution can shorten people's lives. And so I want to talk about some recent work that I've done on this that helps to illustrate this. So first, just there's a lot of people in the world, I guess more than 5.5 billion, who live in places where the concentrations of particulates air pollution exceed the World Health Organization guidelines. Most of that comes from human activity. And now let me just tell you about what the exposure, what my research suggests, the exposure to those high levels of particulates mean for people's life expectancy. So the idea of this paper is that we're never going to be able to run a randomized control trial where you expose one set of people to high levels of pollution for their whole life and another set of people to low levels of pollution. The University of Chicago will never approve that, even if there might be some scientific value in it. So instead, what the paper, and with good reason that they won't approve it, to be clear, instead what the paper aims to do is take advantage of a somewhat idiosyncratic Chinese policy. And that Chinese policy was established during the planning period when China was a much less wealthy country than it is today. And they didn't have enough money to provide winter heating for everybody. So they did a very arbitrary thing. They drew a line across the middle of the country and they said, if you live north of this line, you have free winter heating. And if you live south of the line, you're not allowed to have winter heating. To the north, it was all provided from boilers that run on coal without any real environmental controls. Let's just take a look at the line here. You can see the line follows the Huai River, and then it turns to a mountain range. Again, the idea of this is if you live just to the north, you have free winter heating, but you might also be exposed to lots of air pollution. It's worth noting that the legacy of this policy lives on. I have given a lecture in Chengdu, which you can see is in the northern part of the south, and in the university building there's no heating and all the students are wearing winter coats in the winter. Here's an example of the kind of heating systems they built. They didn't build like a giant central power station. Instead, they built little small boilers like attached to every single apartment building. They have no environmental controls on them, and you can see the pollution being generated there. Okay, so the whole idea of the paper, before I give it away, is to just compare places just to the north to places just to the south and see if there are differences in, first, pollution exposure. And what this figure tells you, each circle is a 1 degree latitude displacement from the river. So the first circle, the first red circle are people who live 0 to 1 degrees north of the river. And the first blue circle to the left of the vertical line is people who live 0 to 1 degrees south. And the idea of the paper is to basically compare places and people who are just to the opposite sides of the river. And what you can see is that there's this very sharp jump in pollution concentrations as you cross the river's edge. And so that should not be surprising given this picture, but here we're verifying it in data. And it's worth about 40 micrograms per cubic meter, or maybe like about a 50% increase in pollution concentrations. Okay, so the second figure, which is the key part of the paper is aims to make the same figure, except now look at life expectancy. And the striking thing is, when you look at this, is that there's almost a mirror image. If you happen to live just to the north of the river, you're living about 3 years less on average than people who live just to the south. And all of that is coming through elevated rates of mortality due to cardiorespiratory causes of death, and it's occurring throughout the life cycle. It's not just the young and the old, but throughout the entire life cycle. So what the two together allowed me to do was to develop an estimate of the relationship between the exposure to an extra 10 micrograms per cubic meter of PM, particulate matter, and what that meant for life expectancy. And what I did was create something called the Air Quality Life Index that aims to take this very academic result and communicate it in a much more accessible way. And so we've created this web portal. Here's a picture of it. It allows you to see the entire world. You can see what particulates concentrations are around the world, as well as what the gain in life expectancy would be if any part of the world came into compliance with WHO standards or some other standard that you can set, or even a country's own standard. And so here in China, you can see, the average person would live about 3 years longer if all of China was brought into compliance with WHO standards. In India, I think it's a little bit more than 4 years. They have probably the world's worst pollution problem at this point in time. And when you put it all together, what's really striking is that air pollution is, I think, the greatest risk to human health on the planet. External risk, I should say. And so here we've just made a graph that kind of compares the impact of exposure to particulates air pollution to other things. One is cigarette smoking, and so actually more life years are lost to air pollution than to cigarette smoking. That's given current cigarette smoking rates. If every man, woman, and child smoked, of course it would be different. But it's also larger impacts than on a variety of other external causes of death that people often talk about. Of course, I can't help but pull out Cook County. A nice thing that you can do is you can zoom in to the county level or the district level. And here you can see that there's been improvements in particulates concentrations in Cook County since 1998 that have, if are sustained, would lead to increases, important increases in life expectancy. Okay, so that's fine. Fossil fuels increase air pollution, and that shortens lives. And so that's an important side effect of using fossil fuels, and we're going to come back to that. But the sixth fact that I want to point to is that fossil fuels are also causing climate change. And let's see if we can, okay, I think you guys have taken over.
Sorry.
It's okay. All right, there we go. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to illustrate what the impacts of climate change are going to be. And Amir had some much more beautiful figures than I will have. But one way I like to illustrate it is it's a little bit, I find it a little bit complicated when the climate scientists talk about changes in Celsius or global mean average of 2 degrees C or something like that. Now, part of it is I went to the Chicago public schools, so we always had difficulty with C there versus F. Every year, the teachers would come in and say, this is the year we're going to switch to Celsius. And then like 3 weeks later in September, they'd be like, you know what, that was too hard. Let's stick with Fahrenheit. And so I never really got the hang of it. So here, I've just illustrated the number of days per year, and this is for India, that the average average person in India faces where the average temperatures, that's the average of the high and the low, is in pretty small ranges. And so you can see that the modal day in India for the average person is probably between 79 and 81. This is current temperatures. But what I really want to highlight is, well, what happens if we have unrestrained climate change to the end of the century? And that the distribution of days would change in this way. And you would have this big piling up of days at very, very high temperatures. And the reason I want to illustrate it that way rather than talk about 2 degrees C is not just because I turned it into Fahrenheit, but also because a lot of the bad stuff of climate change is associated not with days going from 60 to 65, but at the really, really high temperatures where there's lots of stress put on the body and mortality rates get elevated. There's lots of crop stress, labor productivity, all the things that Amir was talking about. And so now let's just take a look at one example of that, which comes from a paper that I've been working on for too long, and I did change the slide so it said this year, so I wouldn't feel so bad about myself. But this is a paper that tries to assess what are the mortality consequences of higher temperatures mainly in India, but it starts by drawing a comparison with the United States. And so here the exercise is what happens if you take a day that's between 70 and 74 and swap it with a day in some other temperature range, keeping our eyes on the higher temperatures. And what you can see is that annual mortality rates go up when you take a day from 70 to 74 and put it at those higher ranges. But I'm going to do a little trick here. So just watch this blue line. This next slide is actually the exact same blue line, but I've just stretched out the y-axis. Okay, so now why would I go and do something like that? Well, the first thing I just want you to see is if you stretch out the y-axis, actually the United States looks basically immune to temperature. Neither hot days nor cold days really seem to have an impact on mortality when you stretch it out. And why did I stretch it out? Because I'm also going to do the same exercise in India. And when you do that, you get this response function. And what I just want you to take away from it is that the impact of high temperatures in India are dramatically worse than they are in the United States. And in those highest temperature bins, you should think of it as the mortality impact is like 25 times the effect that it is in the lower one. And so while in the United States, we have adapted in such a way that we're largely protected from high levels, high temperatures, there's many parts of the world where that's not true, and so a lot of that was embedded in what Amir was talking about. But now I want to try and pull this together a little bit with what I was talking about earlier with the global energy challenge. So if you're India, that is, if you're the red line, you know, that's a terrible way to live. Like, nobody wants to live like that. And you are desperate to get to the blue line. And what is the best way to get to the blue line? Let's get rich. And we learned in slide 1 that there are no examples of people getting rich without using lots and lots of energy. And we also learned along the way here that the cheapest way for people to get lots and lots of energy is to rely on fossil fuels. And so I think this helps illustrate the tension here. And I now want to just try and drive at that tension a little bit more here. So this figure gives cumulative greenhouse gas or CO2 greenhouse gas emissions from the Industrial Revolution to the present day for the United States, India, and China. And you can see the United States has the largest share of actually any country in the world, but certainly of these 3 countries, and through the present. But when you take those projections of what's people think will happen, and you go out to 2050, you can see that the math starts to change. So China is projected to be the biggest emitter. They're already the biggest emitter on an annual basis, but the biggest emitter cumulatively by the middle of the century. You see big increase for India, and by the end of the century, things are really changing. So what that really means, though, with respect to the global energy challenge, is that if you're worried about climate change, what that has to be balanced against is these countries' understandable desire to consume a lot of energy. And one way, so if you want to do something about climate change, the only path that I can see is through reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Projected greenhouse gas emissions are projected to occur in today's developing countries, and yet those are the very places that are most desperate for them. And those are the places that had per capita electricity consumption, a third or a quarter or even a tenth of the United States level. And so much of the global challenge is how to find a way to accommodate our concerns about climate change while also accommodating the need for other countries to develop and use lots of energy. I guess one last thing that's just worth noting, although we kind of covered it, is there's just no shortage of fossil fuels in the ground. And I kind of said this before, but this is like if we were to, this is all the fossil fuels we know about right now, but they're discovering more all the time. There's just would be an unimaginable amount of warming. So that's the sixth fact. The seventh fact, which is maybe worth talking about, is probably less worth talking about than a couple of years ago, but is to just talk about the Paris Agreement, which was a Paris Climate Agreement. And there we go. I think this just helps provide kind of a level setting on where we are. So if you look at the green line, I guess that's the red line. The red line is the path that the world has been on without any kind of restraints on CO2 emissions. And what that path was leading to was about 9 degrees of warming by the end of the century Fahrenheit, maybe 4.5 C. I then contrasted that with the green line, which is like what the scientists say, and we all know the scientists are not economists, and so we shouldn't trust them. But the scientists say we should be on a path to 2 degrees C, and that would require an emissions pattern like the green line. And then what I've done is drawn the blue line. So although the Paris Agreement is only to 2025, this gives you some sense of, with a guess of an extension of the Paris Agreement, what things would look like. And so you could kind of view that as half full or half empty. But I just want to note that even the blue line would require really massive reductions in greenhouse gas emissions relative to the red line. Now, of course, what if we thought we were on the path to the green line, of course, or even the blue line, things probably changed after the 2016 election, and the United States has pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord or is in the process of doing that. I think probably even more important than that, it has even more important than that, it's kind of taken pressure off of other countries, and I think they felt freer to kind of let it rip a little bit on emissions, and we're certainly doing the same thing. We tested whether or not there was a more effective way to enforce environmental standards. So if you take a look at India's environmental laws on the books, they're very stringent, and there is not much that you would complain about, but the enforcement of those laws is not so hot. And so this is a picture in the city of Surat, which is where we did this research. And you can see it's a pretty polluted place despite having very strong rules in the books. And so what we did, and is emblematic of a style of research that a series of people are participating in, and certainly including Fiona, is formed a collaboration with the environmental regulator in Gujarat, the Gujarat Pollution Control Board. And when we first came into contact with them, what they were, they had two ways that they inspected polluters. One is government inspectors went door to door and took readings. And the second was a requirement that all polluters of a certain size had to get a third-party audit, so an environmental company to come and take a measure of what their pollution was and send it to the regulator, and in principle, the polluter could be fined for that. And what once we investigated it, we said, hey, you know, it doesn't seem like this is set up in such a hot way. Like, yes, they need an audit, but the plant gets to choose the auditor, and then the plant gets to pay the auditor. You know, maybe there's a conflict of interest there. And they said, okay, well, all right, you have another idea. And so we came back to them with this idea that aimed to try and break the conflict of interest. And we did that in three ways. The first is, we designed an experiment where we assigned 500 plants to a control group who continued to choose their auditor that way, and 500 plants to a treatment group who we tried to break the conflict of interest. And that was done by not letting plants choose their auditor. It was randomly assigned. The second feature was the plant didn't get to pay the auditor. They paid into a central pool, and the pool paid the auditor. And the third is we did some back checks. And if our readings were similar to the auditors, then the auditor got a cash bonus. But really the main thing is we just tried to break the conflict of interest. Okay, so that this is why I couldn't resist showing this. So here's an example in the control group or the status quo of the readings that the regulator was receiving from the auditors. And all I want you to see is that basically every plant is being reported as being in compliance. They're all below effectively 150 micrograms per cubic meter. But the auditor understood very well, the regulator understood very well that was not true. And so that was, we thought, striking. Now, we had these back checkers, and that gave us a unique opportunity to figure out what was actually the truth. And so what did the back checkers find? They found a much more dispersed distribution of pollution, and 60% of the plants actually had levels that were higher. My favorite part of that are the green bars all the way to your left, which show very low levels of pollution. And what we took away from that was that actually the auditors weren't even taking any readings. And so there were some plants that were perfectly in compliance, but they thought it would be too suspicious to report very low readings, so they just moved them up to a higher level, albeit still below the standard. Okay, so that's a control group. So the first finding of the study is that the status quo, things seemed corrupted. Now let's take a look at the treatment group. And here's what the auditors reported. And remember, what we've tried to do here is to free the auditors from the tyranny of being paid by the plant. And what's striking is that they're reporting a much wider dispersion of pollution concentrations. And you can see they're reporting a lot of them as being above the standard. Now you can also see there's some piling up right below the standard. So I don't think we probably cleaned out all the corruption, but we're getting a much more honest telling, it seems. And remember, we can check this because we also had the back checks. And so here's the back checks. And you can see that the distributions look much more similar. So what we took away from that was that we were able to at least weaken the conflict of interest and get the auditors to be more truthful. Now, the third result, and probably the most important of the whole paper, is well, now the polluters know that the regulator is actually receiving the truth. What did they do? And so we went 6 months later and found that the polluters had reduced their pollution emissions by about 28%. And so we took this as evidence of testing for innovation in policy, and that just by changing the market, in this case the market for auditors, we were able to get this desirable result. A nice thing about this kind of research is because it's done with the government hand in hand from the start, it was very easy to convince the government, or I don't know if it was very easy, but it was easier than it might have been to convince the government to adopt this. And so this is now the way they have set up their auditing market in Gujarat. Okay, so let me try to close and leave a few minutes for questions at the end here. So let me just come back to the beginning. I think, every academic thinks what they work on is the most important thing, but I think among the more important challenges that societies face is what I like to think of as the global energy challenge, where it's not that we have a climate problem, or it's not that we have a pollution problem, or it's not that we have an energy access problem. Even in the United States, we certainly care about inexpensive and reliable energy. It's that we have this global energy challenge, which requires trading off goals on each of those dimensions and trying for societies to try and figure out the right balance for them. And different societies are going to choose different ones based on their income level, how much they care about the future, and a variety of other things. And that is something that researchers at the Harris School and the University of Chicago more broadly are certainly trying to contribute to, and all, I think, captured very acutely in this picture of Beijing of, a couple of years ago. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take some questions.
Great talk. On your first point about the association between GDP growth and energy use.
Yeah.
I've read that 21st century California is a counterexample where the GDP has grown, I think, 22%, while energy use has gone down 17%. Can you comment?
Yeah, so I think there are probably, I think there's a lot of, probably Fiona probably knows even more about this than I do, but I'm sure there are little blips in the data like that, but when you look at it broadly, there's just no country that's achieved high levels of living standards without high levels of energy consumption. And I think we just kind of have to take as fixed. It's not that we shouldn't be efficient with our energy use, but I think we just have to take as fixed. There's going to be a lot more energy consumption because societies around the world want to get wealthier. And the California case is a little complicated. The industrial composition of California changed, and it's not clear that's how representative that is for a whole country somewhere.
Can you talk a little bit about distributed versus independent producers? So, for example, nuclear power. It's very difficult for individuals to have their own nuclear power plants, and they
Probably a good idea.
And much of the debate about solar is the fact that people can have their own power. It's independent power.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the economics of the advantages of concentrated power production versus independent power?
Yeah, so I think there is a DIY movement in energy. The economics of it are pretty bad. It tends to be much more expensive. Maybe not always for the person installing it, because there are subsidies that mean that everyone else in the state are paying for it. But the least expensive way we have to provide energy are through giant power stations, be they solar farms or nuclear plants or natural gas plants. We could spend a long time talking about the various subsidies that states have in place that make it desirable for an individual to do that, although I think socially, maybe less desirable.
What are some things you do in your own life to reduce your energy consumption, or things that you would encourage individuals to do, since we can't make, a huge impact globally right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, New York Times, maybe you subscribe to it, they have that climate forward thing, and every week it's like one thing to do. I think that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Because it takes what's a super important series of problems, and I think, sometimes I can't tell if it's an onion thing or not. and like trivializes them, like, well, maybe you should compost a little bit more. Well, you know what? That's probably not really the issue here. I think probably what is striking to me is actually, if you took this picture in Beijing right now, this picture's 5 years old, maybe it's 4 years old. Beijing looks so different now. And that's because the Chinese government has declared a war on pollution. And I think probably the most important thing individuals can do is express a desire for particular political outcomes. And the energy problem is not, to your point, it cannot really be prosecuted it's very difficult to prosecute at the individual level. So I think expressing your voice in the political system is probably the best way to do it. That's really the only way to change the way we construct energy markets is one clear example. Now, I'll give you one individual thing that I do think is potentially doable and useful, and way better than like whatever the last few months been, like composting or your coffee grounds or some. Yeah, becoming vegan, all that stuff. And like, there's nothing wrong with any of those things, but I think they're on a different scale. And often very expensive. They're not very, it's not that they produce no effect, but per dollar of effort, they don't look very good. So one thing you could do is you go to carbon markets and you could buy permanent and retire it. It's not that easy to do, but it's something that I think is very direct. And I bet you per your dollar, replace any value on your time, it's way more effective. So.
Do we learn anything from countries that have a high concentration of nuclear, like France or?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting experience going on in South Korea right now. They seem to be building nuclear plants very inexpensively. And I don't think the world completely understands why or how, and we certainly can't build them that inexpensively here. If we could understand how to build the plants, and there's some explanations, I think there's something to be learned there. But we got to get around the political problem of what to do about nuclear waste. That's another problem, which was not even in my chart.
You mentioned connecting the energy price to the social cost of energy.
Yeah.
And when we consider that with the necessity of any economic growth, with consumption of more energy, how can we achieve that without looking at the historical responsibility of the countries who emitted, like the U.S.?
Yeah. That's a great question. This is recorded, right? That's a very good question. Reparations in all of forms are very, very challenging politically, and I think that's what you're getting at. And I study economics, so I'm going to punt on that one. But what you're saying is at the heart of this. Like, if you're sitting in Bihar, India, like, you're not thinking like, I got to really worry about climate change. You're thinking like, I got to get above 230 kilowatt hours per year because it's literally killing me today. It's not killing me in 25 or 30 or 50 years. It's killing my family today. And I think that's the mindset, and I don't think it's an illegitimate mindset. I think if any of us were in those shoes, that might be how we see it.
So if political action was needed, how do we ensure action is taken even if maybe it's not the best solution? And does that inform your analysis at all? Should it talking about political feasibility?
Talking about what?
Political feasibility of solutions.
I think, is your question, gosh, carbon pricing sure seems hard. Shouldn't we do something else? So I think it's important to know your lanes. I'm not in charge of any political process anywhere. My view is what I can contribute is helping people see how expensive certain choices are, or the trade-offs inherent in them. And I don't know if this is where you're edging, but I'm going to put it on you. I think the reason it's so important to illustrate that is, and to focus on the kind of restructuring of energy markets in the way that I was proposing by pricing things correctly, is that if we do things in a very expensive way, which maybe is more politically feasible for now, I think our appetite to do very much of it is not going to be very high. You know, it's not often that, yeah, if you go to the grocery store and tomatoes in one basket are $10 for one and they're $1 for one in another basket, people will occasionally buy some out of the $10 basket. Maybe it's closer to the register, or they might like the color of those a little bit better, but they're not going to buy that many of them in the end, is my view. And so that's why I think it's like so important to be ruthless and relentless in searching out the least cost ways to address a lot of these problems. And if we don't, I think we'll end up not doing very much of it. That's my answer.
So maybe a quick follow-up question, if I may. How do you present your research to across the aisle conservatives?
Well, first of all, I didn't say anything about what political party I'm a member of.
I don't know, do you tailor it to different
Look, these are all facts. There's no, not one party has a monopoly on facts. And again, I think like the role of academics, the role of the Harris School, is to make sure that there's an advocate for facts. And I think oftentimes when those facts are not out there, that leaves kind of a vacuum that people who do have vested interests, that may not be societal wide, but might be no wider than their business or no wider than whatever their particular environmental cause is, are happy to fill that space. And I think what can be so valuable about policy schools and academic research is to try to ensure that facts, as best we understand them, have a seat at the table and at the discussion. Now, how that gets sorted out is obviously going to be done through a political lens. But I'm confident that when facts aren't at the table, we're going to end up at a worse place. That's probably a great way to end the Keller School opening. Okay.